It didn't begin with the music, it began with a dream, quiet, almost fragile, born on a dairy farm in the rolling green hills of upstate New York, a dream that whispered promises of peace, love, and unity at a time when the world felt like it was tearing itself apart. 3 days later, that whisper would become a roar heard across history. Woodstock wasn't meant to be a revolution. To the four young organizers, it was supposed to be a modest gathering, 50,000 people at most, just enough to break even financially and bring a little joy to a weary generation. But for the 400,000 souls who would eventually descend on that farm, it became something else entirely, an awakening, a fragile moment where hope felt real again. Yet beneath the glow of that hope, beneath the songs, the laughter, the painted vans and barefoot dancers, there was something the world never saw: exhaustion, hunger, confusion, and a quiet tragedy weaving its way through the mud. This was never just a festival about posters and slogans. It was the story of people who walked for miles after abandoning their cars, people who slept under torn tarps as storms ripped across the fields, people who fed strangers, offered blankets, shared cigarettes, and built a tiny temporary world where no one was truly alone. And at the center of it all stood one man, Max Yasgur, a 52-year-old dairy farmer with nothing but land, cows, and a stubborn belief that freedom, especially the freedom to speak, to gather, to dream, was worth protecting. He wasn't a hippie, he wasn't a rebel, but when long-haired promoters knocked on his door asking to rent 600 acres for a music festival, he said yes. Curiosity moved him, conviction guided him, and fate would soon overwhelm him. Because the idea of Woodstock had already slipped beyond anyone's control. Across college campuses, cafes, and dorm rooms, word spread like wildfire. To the youth of America, this wasn't just a concert. It was a chance, maybe the only chance, to live, even for a single weekend, in the kind of world they desperately wished existed. By the time August arrived, the storm was already coming. The summer of 1969 felt like a fault line running through America. The Vietnam War was devouring young lives overseas. Cities were erupting in protest and smoke. A generation had stopped believing their parents' world could save them. Amid that turbulence stood Max Yasgur, ordinary, soft-spoken, and unsuspecting. A man who had spent his life tending cows, mending fences, and trusting that decency still mattered. He had no idea that his quiet farm in Bethel, New York, was about to become the epicenter of a cultural earthquake. When the promoters told him their little music festival might attract 50,000 people, he imagined a few cars lining his country roads, a few tents in the grass. Nothing more. Something manageable, something harmless. But the idea of Woodstock carried a power they could never foresee. Across the nation, young people packed into vans splashed with painted flowers and peace signs. Friends piled into beat-up cars with guitars, blankets, and just enough gas money to make it north. Some brought sleeping bags, others brought nothing but hope. By August 15th, the roads leading into Bethel were no longer roads. They were rivers of humanity. Cars stopped. Engines overheated. Tens of thousands of people simply abandoned their vehicles and walked for miles, over hills, through fields, along fences, a pilgrimage unlike anything the countryside had ever seen. The fences meant to control the crowd collapsed in minutes. Ticket booths became pointless. The organizers surrendered. Woodstock was now a free festival. And just as the first chords drifted out over Max Yasgur's fields, dark clouds gathered above the hills. The sky cracked open and rain poured down in sheets, soaking every tarp, every blanket, every barefoot dreamer. The wind tore through ponchos and tents like paper, but no one left. They stayed, they danced, they sang louder than the storm. From his porch, Max looked out at what had once been quiet farmland. It was now an ocean of bodies, colors, voices, and dreams stretching to the horizon. His cows had fled from the noise, his fences were gone, his pastures churned to mud. Yet he could not bring himself to feel anger. Something extraordinary was taking shape, a living, breathing proof that for one brief flicker in time, people could choose hope over fear. Woodstock hadn't truly begun with music. It had begun with a storm of rain, of humanity, of faith in something better. Carlos Santana was only 22 years old when he stepped onto the Woodstock stage, young, unproven, unknown beyond a handful of clubs. But on that August afternoon, something happened that would follow him for the rest of his life. Hours earlier, backstage, Santana had taken mescaline, a hallucinogen handed to him by someone who promised the effects would fade long before he had to perform. He believed them. He relaxed. He let the drug take hold. But fate had different plans. At 2 p.m., a frantic stagehand tapped him on the shoulder. "You're on right now." His heart froze. He wasn't ready. The world wasn't steady. When Santana looked down at his guitar, its neck twisted and curled like a living serpent, breathing, writhing, waiting to strike. The crowd of nearly 400,000 people swayed like an ocean, moving in impossible rhythms he could barely comprehend. Most musicians would have refused to go on a stage. Santana didn't. Barefoot, trembling, pupils dilated, he walked into the blinding sun and let instinct take control. And then, miraculously, the chaos transformed into brilliance. Every note he played in soul sacrifice cut through the haze like lightning, syncing his unsteady vision with the raw pulse of the music. It became one of the most legendary performances in rock history. Later he would laugh and confess, "I thought my guitar was a snake. I was just trying to keep it from biting me." But Woodstock was full of moments like that. Beautiful, reckless moments standing 1 inch away from disaster. Many in the crowd were lost in their own altered realities as well. Some wandered barefoot through the mud, speaking to no one. Others lay in the fields, staring at the sky for hours. A few never came back to themselves. Before the festival was over, 2 people would die, one from an overdose, another crushed by a tractor while sleeping in the field. Woodstock promised peace, but it also revealed how fragile peace truly was. Still, the music never stopped. The generation refused to let the chaos swallow them. And as night fell across the hills, another voice, one fierce, fragile, and unforgettable, was fighting her way through the gridlock, desperate to reach the stage in time. A woman who would arrive like a storm herself, Janis Joplin. By the second day of Woodstock, the world outside Max Yasgur's farm had collapsed into a graveyard of abandoned cars. Engines sat cold on the highways, doors hung open. People wandered for miles, following music they couldn't yet hear. Somewhere in that endless line of the stalled vehicles sat Janis Joplin, 26 years old, anxious, jittery, chain-smoking in the back seat of her car. She was supposed to perform that night, but the clock was mercilessly ticking, and the road was not moving. The festival organizers, desperate and nearly out of options, made a decision as wild as the festival itself. They sent a helicopter. When the chopper descended onto the highway, its blades whipped dust, paper, and hair into swirling chaos. Thousands of stranded fans lifted their arms and cheered. Janis climbed aboard, leaving behind her luggage, her band's equipment, and the choking tension of the gridlock below. From the sky, the sight stunned her, a patchwork world of color and humanity stretched to the horizon. Tents, blankets, smoke trails, bodies moving like waves in a pulsing ocean. She wasn't flying into a stage. She was flying into history. When the helicopter landed behind the platform, Janis stepped out, trembling. She told her bandmates to act like this was just another gig, but everyone knew it wasn't. Nothing about this moment was normal. She kicked off her shoes, walked onto the muddy stage barefoot, and began to sing "Piece of My Heart." Her voice, raspy, aching, electric, cut through the cold night air. It wasn't her cleanest performance. She was exhausted, nervous, and floating under the haze of alcohol and drugs. But none of that mattered. Every scream, every crack, every raw, bleeding note felt like her soul was tearing open in front of 500,000 strangers. For those who watched, it was unforgettable. For her, it was a confession. After her set, Janis didn't leave the festival grounds. She wandered through the mud with the crowd, blending into the sea of faces. Some fans claimed they saw her sitting under a tarp, singing softly to herself long after the lights went down. To them, she looked free, but she also looked heartbreakingly alone. A little over a year later, she would be gone, dead from a heroin overdose in a Los Angeles hotel at the age of 27. At Woodstock, she was surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people, but in her fame, she stood utterly alone. And as her voice drifted away into the night, another legend, one who would redefine American music itself, was preparing for a performance the world would never forget. Jimi Hendrix? For 3 long days, one question echoed through the muddy fields like a heartbeat. When is Hendrix playing? Jimi Hendrix, the prophet of electric sound, the man who could make a guitar whisper, scream, and pray, was the performer everyone had come to see. His presence hovered over Woodstock like a storm waiting to break. But delays plagued the festival. Storms tore through the fields, equipment failed, schedules fell apart, and Hendrix's performance kept getting pushed later and later and later. By the time dawn broke on Monday morning, the vast ocean of 400,000 people had dwindled to a small, exhausted handful. No more than 25,000 survivors still sitting in the mud after 3 sleepless nights. But those who stayed would witness something that felt less like a concert and more like a farewell. Hendrix walked onto the stage wearing a white fringed jacket, a red bandana, and a distant, quiet expression, like a man who understood that something in his generation was ending. His original band, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, had broken up just weeks before, so he played with a new, barely rehearsed group he called Gypsy Sun and Rainbows. They had practiced together only once, but when Hendrix touched the strings, the world fell silent, and then he began the Star-Spangled Banner. It wasn't planned, it wasn't polished, it was a cry, raw, violent, beautiful. Through his guitar's feedback, Hendrix painted the sound of America. Exploding bombs, wailing sirens, machine gun fire, helicopters slicing the sky, the terrible soundtrack of Vietnam bleeding through the anthem of a divided nation. Some heard protest, some heard pain, some heard hope. Hendrix didn't explain, he didn't need to. The field was silent when he finished. People wept, others stared at the ground, shaken by something they didn't have words for. That morning became one of the most iconic images in American history. Jimi Hendrix kneeling before his Stratocaster like a preacher at the altar of a country struggling to understand itself. But behind the legend was a man quietly fading. Barely a year later, Hendrix would be dead at 27, joining the same tragic club as Janis Joplin. Woodstock crowned him an immortal, but it also marked his farewell, and as his final notes drifted into the morning air, one man, the farmer who made Woodstock possible, was left standing in the ruins of his land, wondering what price he had truly paid. When the last amplifier crackled into silence on August 18th, 1969, a heavy quiet rolled across the fields, thick, unsettling, almost mournful. It was the kind of silence that comes not after a celebration, but after a storm. Max Yasgur stood at the edge of what had once been his green, peaceful pastures. Now it was a wasteland of mud, crushed cans, broken fences, and abandoned belongings. His cows were gone. His barns were damaged. His fields looked as though a war had swept through them. But what hurt him most wasn't the destruction. It was what happened next. The man who had opened his home and land to 400,000 strangers, a man who believed in peace, in unity, in the right of young people to gather, suddenly became a villain in his own town. His neighbors, many of them lifelong friends, turned on him with cold fury. The traffic jams? His fault. The noise? The trash? The chaos? His fault. The overflowing toilets, the blocked roads, the helicopters rattling the windows? All his fault. Local stores refused to serve him. At the post office, people turned their backs. In church, whispers followed him down the aisle like shadows. Someone even spray-painted the word "traitor" on a fence near his farm. Max never regretted the ideals Woodstock represented. He believed deeply in letting people be free, even if he didn't understand their music, their clothes, or their dreams. But the cost was far greater than he had imagined. His health began to decline in the years that followed. He sold most of his cattle. Eventually, he left Bethel altogether, telling friends he no longer belonged there. A few months after the festival, he told a reporter quietly, "If I had to do it over again, I would, but it broke something inside me." When Max Yasgur died in 1973, at only 53 years old, most of the young people who had danced on his fields had no idea what had become of the man who made their dream possible. To them, Woodstock was freedom. To him, it was the end of innocence. Yet even in his pain, the memory of what happened on his land still shined. A moment when, for just 3 fleeting days, humanity remembered how to share. When the last cars finally disappeared into the distance and the final chords dissolved into the hills, Bethel felt eerily hollow, like a carnival after its lights have been shut off. The world had witnessed a miracle of music, youth, and madness, but the land itself remained wounded. Volunteers, some locals, many strangers, stayed behind for weeks, knee-deep in mud and trash. They picked up cans, repaired shattered fences, gathered broken tents, and tried to piece together what was left of Yasgur's farm. But some things simply couldn't be restored. The spirit of Woodstock lingered in the air like smoke, refusing to fade. For those who lived through those 3 days, the memories never left. They remembered sleeping beneath rain-soaked blankets, sharing the last crust of bread with strangers, dancing barefoot until sunrise, and feeling for the first time that the world might be bigger, kinder, softer than they'd been told. They also remembered fear, the fear of running out of food, the fear of losing friends in the sea of bodies, the fear when helicopters sliced through the fog to rescue musicians stranded miles away in deadlocked traffic, the fear when lightning cracked above the metal stage and yet dozens of performers kept playing, defying the storm. Some remembered love found in the mud, brief, bright, unforgettable. Some remembered people they met once and never saw again. Some remembered the faces of those who never made it home. And in the years that followed, the photographs became myths, frozen moments that captured the beauty and the ache of an entire generation. A naked man asleep on a motorcycle under the morning sun. A couple wrapped in a blanket, clinging to each other as rain drenched the hill. Carlos Santana lost in a trance of color and sound. Jimi Hendrix kneeling before his guitar as if the earth itself were listening. Each photograph told a story of freedom. Yet together, they whispered a quieter truth. Innocence, once found, is never found again. The children of the 60s grew older. Peace signs gave way to briefcases. Flower-painted vans rusted in driveways. Life moved on, and the dream dimmed. But every August, someone still drives up to that hill in upstate New York, to stand where history breathed, where mud became myth, and where, for 3 impossible days, hope felt real. They come to listen, not for music, but for an echo, a faint hum beneath the soil, a reminder that even chaos can be beautiful. Woodstock wasn't perfect, it wasn't peaceful, it wasn't even planned, but it was real, and the world has never seen anything like it again. Woodstock has become more than a festival. It's a symbol shaped by photographs, memories, and stories passed down like fragile treasures. But the truth behind those 3 days is far more complicated, far more human, and far more haunting than the legends we tell. It was messy. It was chaotic. It was dangerous. It was miraculous. And for a generation searching for meaning in the middle of a fractured world, it became a moment that proved something extraordinary. Even when society is trembling, hope can still rise from the mud. Many of the people who are there now carry gray hair and soft lines around their eyes. They built families, careers, and futures their younger selves could never have imagined. But ask them about Woodstock and the years melt away. For a brief moment, their voices grow distant, warm, almost trembling, because they remember the storm clouds opening above the music. They remember strangers becoming family. They remember Janis's raw cry, Santana's trance, Hendrix's impossible anthem. They remember Max Yasgur standing quietly at the edge of his broken land, unknowingly giving a generation their most unforgettable memory. Most of all, they remember the feeling that the world, however briefly, could be different. And now the question belongs to us. Could something like Woodstock ever happen again? Or was it a once-in-a-lifetime miracle? A moment the world only receives once before time buries it beneath the noise of everything that came after? Tell us what you think. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of a time when music could shake the earth and hope could rise from chaos, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There are more untold histories waiting to be uncovered, more voices from the past that still echo in the present, and together we'll bring them back to life.